War is hell. We have heard that phrase since we were children. We are taught that war is tragedy, sacrifice, and the ultimate failure of diplomacy. But what if I told you that for a select group of people, war isn't failure? It is success. It isn't a tragedy. It is a business model more reliable than banking, more profitable than oil, and more protected than any monopoly in history. For over 200 years, across 5 major American conflicts, 5 specific families have stood in the shadows, not as patriots, but as beneficiaries. While soldiers bled in the trenches of France and the deserts of Iraq, these dynasties saw their net worth multiply by orders of magnitude. They didn't just profit from the chaos, they built the infrastructure that made the chaos inevitable. We are talking about the DuPonts, the explosive kings who turned gunpowder into a chemical empire. The Rockefellers, the oil titans who fueled the tanks of both sides. The Morgans, the bankers who financed the slaughter when governments ran out of cash. The Lockheed legacy, the aviation pioneers who turned the sky into a kill zone. And the Halliburton machine, the logistics giant that privatized the very act of military support. This is not a conspiracy theory born in a chat room. This is a matter of public record. The contracts are signed, the dividends are paid, the receipts are in the archives. The pattern is terrifyingly simple. War is declared, stocks surge, no bid contracts are awarded, profits explode, the war ends, they keep the money. And when the next war starts, they are waiting at the door, ready to sell the keys to the arsenal. I am going to show you exactly how this machine works. We will trace the blood money from the War of 1812 to the forever wars of the Middle East. We will look at the cost-plus contracts, the revolving doors, and the lobbyist armies that ensure peace is never profitable enough to last. Because once you see the pattern, you will realize that for these 5 families, peace is not the goal. Peace is just the downtime between quarters. Let us start with the family that literally invented the American military-industrial complex before the term even existed. The DuPonts. Today, you know them for Teflon pans and Lycra. But the DuPont fortune wasn't built on non-stick cookware. It was built on black powder. The story begins in 1800. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont flees post-revolutionary France and lands in America. He is a chemist, trained by the legendary Lavoisier. He looks at the young, violent, expanding American frontier and sees one thing: a desperate need for explosives, to clear land, to mine coal, and, inevitably, to kill people. In 1802, he builds his mills on the Brandywine River in Delaware. It was the perfect strategic location, close enough to Washington to sell to the government, isolated enough that when a mill blew up, and they often did, it wouldn't level a city. The War of 1812 was their proof of concept. The US government was desperate for powder. DuPont delivered. But the Civil War was their IPO. This was the first industrial war. The Union Army fired millions of rounds. DuPont's mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They produced 4 million pounds of gunpowder for the North. The contracts were worth millions, hundreds of millions in today's money. And here is the cynical genius of the war profiteer. Ideally, the DuPonts were Northern Democrats who opposed abolition. Some family members openly sympathized with the South. But ideology doesn't pay dividends, contracts do, so they sold to the Union because the Union had the gold. By 1865, they were no longer just a business. They were a strategic asset of the United States government. They had made themselves indispensable. If the Civil War was the launchpad, World War I was the moonshot. When Europe caught fire in 1914, the DuPonts didn't wait for America to join. They started selling to the British and French immediately. TNT, smokeless powder, gun cotton. They ramped up production by 2,600%. They built entire company towns to house the workers making the explosives. By the time the US entered the war in 1917, DuPont was supplying 40% of all explosives used by the Allied forces. The financial results were staggering. In 1914, DuPont's net earnings were $5 million. In 1918, they were $82 million. That is a 1,600% increase in profit in 4 years. In today's dollars, they cleared over $1 billion in pure profit from the slaughter of a generation. And what did they do with that blood money? They didn't give it back. They used it to buy General Motors. They used it to pivot into chemicals, creating the modern plastics industry. They laundered the money of death into the consumer economy of peace. This established the first rule of the war profit pattern: use the war to fund the empire. But DuPont was just providing the ammo. To fight a modern war, you need more than powder. You need fuel. And that brings us to the second family. The family that made sure every tank, plane, and ship had something to burn. If DuPont provided the spark, the Rockefellers provided the fuel. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled 90% of America's refining capacity. But his true genius wasn't just crushing competitors, it was realizing that modern warfare would be fought with engines, not horses. The turning point was the Spanish-American War in 1898. The U.S. Navy was transitioning from coal to oil. Coal was heavy, dirty, and required massive crews to shovel. Oil was efficient. Rockefeller secured the contracts. He established the precedent. To move a fleet, you must pay Standard Oil. But World War I was the first true oil war. Tanks, airplanes, trucks, submarines. The entire machinery of death ran on petroleum. Standard Oil, though technically broken up into companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron in 1911, still operated as a coordinated hydra. They fueled the Allied war effort. The contracts were worth hundreds of millions. But here is the dark chapter the history books often skip: the double dip. While Rockefeller companies fueled the US and Britain, Standard Oil's German subsidiaries fueled the Kaiser. Through a complex web of neutral countries and shell companies, the empire profited from both sides of the trench line. This wasn't treason. It was multinational business. In the boardroom, there are no allies or axis. There are only customers. This cynical neutrality reached its peak in World War II. While American GIs were landing on beaches, Standard Oil of New Jersey, now Exxon, was under investigation by the U.S. Senate. Why? Because they had entered into a cartel agreement with IG Farben, the German chemical giant that manufactured Zyklon B gas. They shared patents for synthetic rubber, critical technology that allowed the Nazi war machine to keep rolling despite being cut off from natural rubber supplies. Senator Harry Truman, before he was president, led the committee. He famously declared that Standard Oil's actions were treasonable. The evidence was damning. They had prioritized their business agreement with the Nazis over the national security of the United States. And what was the punishment? Nothing. The War Department intervened. They said, "We need their oil to win the war. We cannot prosecute them now." The investigation was shelved. The contracts continued. The profits flowed. The Rockefellers learned the ultimate lesson. If you are essential to the war, you are above the law. But armies need more than explosives and oil. They need the one resource that evaporates fastest in war: money. Enter the House of Morgan. J.P. Morgan didn't just run a bank. He ran the private central bank of the Western world. He understood a simple truth. Governments at war are desperate borrowers. They will sign any paper, pay any interest rate, and mortgage their future just to survive the present. When World War I broke out in 1914, the US was officially neutral, but Wall Street was not. J.P. Morgan Jr. arranged massive loans to Britain and France. Between 1914 and 1917, while Wilson preached neutrality, Morgan banks lent over $2 billion to the Allies. That is over $50 billion today. This created a massive conflict of interest. If Germany won the war, Britain and France would default. The House of Morgan would collapse, and it would take the US economy down with it. By 1917, the Allies were on the brink of bankruptcy and defeat. Suddenly, the pressure on President Wilson to enter the war became overwhelming. Was it to make the world safe for democracy, or was it to make the world safe for J.P. Morgan's loan portfolio? Senator George Norris saw through the charade. During the debate on declaring war, he stood up and said, "We are going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He was right, but he was outvoted. America went to war. The Allies won. The loans were repaid with interest, and Morgan didn't stop there. After the war, they financed the reparations payments from Germany. They collected fees on the money flowing from Germany to Britain and fees on the money flowing from Britain back to the US. They built a conveyor belt of debt, and they stood at the switch, taking a cut of every dollar that passed through. The Morgan dynasty proved that in modern warfare, the bank is more powerful than the tank. The bank decides who can afford to fight, and for how long. But as the 20th century moved forward, a new player emerged. A player that combined the industrial scale of DuPont with the political connections of Morgan. They didn't just sell raw materials, they sold the delivery systems of death. By the mid-20th century, the battlefield had moved up. Control the ground, you win the battle. Control the sky, you win the war. Enter Lockheed Martin. They didn't just build planes, they built the ultimate mechanism for extracting public wealth, the cost-plus contract. In World War II, they proved their worth with the P-38 Lightning fighter. But their real innovation wasn't aerodynamic, it was political. Lockheed realized that if you build a weapon system complex enough and spread the factories across enough congressional districts, the government cannot cancel it. It becomes too big to fail, military edition. Take the C-5 Galaxy transport plane in the 1960s. The original contract was $2.1 billion. By delivery, the cost was $5.3 billion. A 150% cost overrun. In the private sector, if you quote a price and charge double, you get sued. In the defense sector, if you charge double, you get a bonus. Because under cost-plus rules, the government covers every expense plus a guaranteed profit percentage. The more inefficient you are, the more profit you make. Waste isn't a bug, it's a feature. This strategy culminated in the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Original budget, $233 billion. Current lifetime cost, $1.7 trillion. It is the most expensive weapon system in human history. It was plagued by defects for years. Yet, Congress keeps funding it. Why? Because Lockheed Martin strategically placed F-35 suppliers in 45 different states. Voting against the jet means voting against jobs in your own district. They engineered a weapon that holds the US budget hostage. But while Lockheed owned the sky, another company realized there was a fortune to be made in the dirt. Halliburton, founded as an oil services company in 1919, they realized that the logistics of drilling for oil in a desert look exactly like the logistics of fighting a war in a desert. You need roads, you need housing, you need food, you need water. In Vietnam, Halliburton's subsidiary, Brown and Root, paved the way for the American invasion. They built the ports, the airfields, and the bases. How did they get the contracts? Politics. The founders were massive donors to Lyndon B. Johnson. As LBJ rose to the presidency, Brown and Root's contracts rose with him. They turned political donations into billions in revenue. This model reached its zenith during the War on Terror. In the 1990s, the CEO of Halliburton was Dick Cheney. In 2000, he became Vice President of the United States. 3 years later, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Who got the contract to rebuild the country? Who got the contract to feed the troops? Who got the contract to do the laundry? Halliburton. And they got it via a no-bid contract. The government argued there was no time for competition. Halliburton billed the U.S. taxpayer billions for meals never served, fuel never delivered, and showers that electrocuted soldiers. The Pentagon's own auditors found billions in unsupported costs. The result? Halliburton's stock tripled. Cheney left office with millions in stock options. The message was clear. War is a transfer of wealth from the American public to the private contractors who run the logistics. So we have the explosives, DuPont. The fuel, Rockefeller. The money, Morgan. The weapons, Lockheed. The logistics, Halliburton. Together they form a self-perpetuating ecosystem. They don't just supply the war, they create the dependency on war. They hire the generals who approve the contracts. They fund the think tanks that recommend the interventions. They lobby the Congress that votes for the budget. It is easy to look at these 5 families and see them as separate success stories. But if you layer their histories on top of each other, you realize they are all running the same script. They didn't just get lucky, they executed an algorithm. This is the 7-step war profit formula that has been used to drain the American treasury for 2 centuries. Step 1, the pre-position. Before the first shot is fired, you must be the only option. DuPont built the mills before the Civil War. Rockefeller monopolized the oil before the tanks were invented. They established themselves as national champions. Too big to fail, too essential to ignore. Step 2. The panic contract. When war starts, the government panics. They don't have time for competitive bidding. They need 10,000 trucks now. This is the no-bid window. Halliburton mastered this in Iraq. When the house is on fire, you don't negotiate the price of the hose. You pay whatever the fireman asks. Step 3. The cost-plus trap. This is the financial engine. Never sign a fixed-price contract. Always sign cost-plus. If a bomb costs $1,000 to make, and you charge $100, you make $100. But if you are inefficient, if you waste materials and delay production, and the bomb costs $5,000 to make. Step 4. The budget overrun. Once the project is started, it becomes too big to cancel. The sunk cost fallacy kicks in. The Pentagon has already spent $50 billion on a jet. If it doesn't work, they look incompetent. So they spend another $50 billion to fix it. Lockheed Martin has used this leverage to turn the F-35 program into a $1 trillion annuity that will pay out until 2070. Step 5. The revolving door. Who approves these contracts? Generals and admirals. What happens when they retire? They go to work for the companies they just paid. It is a silent bribe. Approve our contract today, and we will hire you as a consultant for $500,000 a year tomorrow. The regulators are really just future employees. Step 6. The lobbying machine. Peace is bad for business, so you must manufacture threat. You fund the think tanks that write the papers saying, China is rising or Russia is moving. You donate to the congressmen who sit on the Armed Services Committee. You don't create the war, but you dry the wood and light the match. Step 7. The diversification. Finally, you take the blood money and wash it. DuPont took Civil War profits and built a chemical empire. Rockefeller took WWI profits and bought real estate. By the time the public realizes they were robbed, the money is already in a family trust, invested in harmless consumer brands. So, what is the total tab? If we add up the documented revenue from these 5 dynasties, DuPont, Rockefeller, Morgan, Lockheed, Halliburton, across every major conflict from 1812 to today, the number exceeds $485 billion, adjusted for inflation. That is nearly $500 billion transferred from the American taxpayer to private bank accounts. And that is a conservative estimate. It doesn't include the stock appreciation, the land grabs, or the interest on the debt used to pay them. But let's just look at that $485 billion. What could we have bought with that money if we hadn't spent it on explosives and no-bid logistics? We could have funded free college for every American student for 20 years. We could have built a high-speed rail network connecting every major U.S. city. We could have rebuilt every crumbling bridge and road in the nation. We could have funded a Manhattan Project for cancer research that might have cured the disease by now. Instead, we bought 4 million pounds of gunpowder. We bought fuel that burned in the desert. We bought meals for soldiers that were never served. We bought a century of death. And do not think for a second that this is ancient history. In 2023, the U.S. military budget was $816 billion. 5 companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, received over $200 billion of that. 25% of the entire defense budget went to 5 boardrooms. The F-35 fighter jet alone has suppliers in 45 states. This is intentional. It means 90 senators have constituents whose jobs depend on the war machine. To vote against the war is to vote against your own voters. They have engineered a system where peace is politically impossible. Here is the final, darkest truth about the war profit pattern. It isn't just that they make money. It isn't just that they manufacture consent. It is that they are above the law. In any other industry, if you defraud the government, you go to prison. If you trade with the enemy during wartime, you are executed for treason. But when you are one of the 5 families, the rules of justice do not apply. Look at the record. Standard Oil was investigated by the Senate for sharing synthetic rubber patents with the Nazis. Senator Truman called it treason. Did the Rockefellers go to jail? No. The War Department stepped in and said, "We need the fuel. Leave them alone." DuPont was investigated for monopolizing explosives in the 1930s. The Nye Committee called them merchants of death. Did they lose their contracts? No. They became the primary contractor for the Manhattan Project. Halliburton was caught billing for ghost meals and ghost fuel in Iraq. Did Dick Cheney face an indictment? No. The company paid a fine, a fraction of their profits, and kept the contract. The pattern is consistent. Investigations are opened, headlines are written, fines are paid. But the fines are just the cost of doing business. They are a tax on theft. No CEO goes to handcuffs. No dynasty loses its fortune. They are protected by the ultimate shield, necessity. The military cannot fight without Lockheed's jets. They cannot move without Exxon's fuel. They cannot shoot without DuPont's chemicals. The government has made itself a hostage to its own suppliers. So, is this history? Or is it the future? Look at the ticker symbols today. When the war in Ukraine started, Lockheed Martin stock surged 25% in weeks. When tensions rise in the Middle East, Raytheon and General Dynamics hit all-time highs. The business model hasn't changed, it has just become more efficient. We are entering an era of great power competition. The rhetoric is about democracy versus autocracy, but the reality is about contracts. New wars require new toys, hypersonic missiles, autonomous drones, AI-driven surveillance. The descendants of the Morgan, Rockefeller, and DuPont empires have already diversified into these sectors. They are ready for the next century of conflict. We are taught that wars are fought for freedom, for security, or for ideology. But the financial history of the last 200 years tells a different story. War is fought for ROI, return on investment. The soldiers are the labor, the taxpayers are the investors, who get no return. And the 5 families are the management. The $485 billion extracted from the American public wasn't just money. It was potential. It was the schools we didn't build, the hospitals we didn't fund, the infrastructure we let crumble. We traded our national prosperity for a century of global dominance, and the dividends went to 5 boardrooms. Now you see the pattern. DuPont, Rockefeller, Morgan, Lockheed, Halliburton, 5 names, 5 wars, 1 result. They profit, we pay, and the soldiers die. They will teach you in school that these companies are patriots. They will tell you they serve the nation, but the contracts are public record. The math doesn't lie. Peace doesn't pay dividends. War does. And as long as war is the most profitable industry in America, peace will remain impossible. This is Economy Money. If this series changed how you look at the headlines, subscribe, because the next war is already being budgeted, and you are the one picking up the tab. We'll see you in the next one.